right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our another installment, if you will, of emerging Revolutionary War. My name is Dan Welch for Emerging Civil War, and tonight Emerging Revolutionary War. And tonight I'm with John Maass, and tonight we're going to be talking about the road to Yorktown, Jefferson, Lafayette, and the British invasion of Virginia, a book that he published with the History Press. I have a copy of it right here. Really looking forward to this talk this evening. But before we dive in, I want to take a moment to let folks know that are watching that we only have 4 tickets left for our fall Emerging Revolutionary War tour, which is going to be happening the second weekend of November. If it's something that you are interested in, do not hesitate to reach out and let us know. As I mentioned, we just have 4 tickets left, and you will not want to miss out on this tour. We're going to be hitting Friday night a strong overview, if you will, to prepare you for what you're going to see Saturday and Sunday. And then Saturday, we're going to spend the whole day covering the Battle of Monmouth with our tour guide, Billy Griffith of Emerging Revolutionary War. He's got some really exclusive stops for us to see, places that folks normally cannot get out and see. So it's going to be one heck of a day on Saturday. And then Sunday morning, ERW's co-founder, Phil Greenwald, is going to be taking us through Valley Forge. Phil's got a recent book out on Valley Forge in the Emerging Revolutionary War series. You are not going to want to miss that program as well. So we only have 4 tickets left for the fall bus tour. For more information, go to our website, emergingrevolutionarywar.org, or you can always send us an email as well, and we can get you more information and signed up if that is something that you're interested in. So tonight, let's go ahead and dig into the road to Yorktown with John Maass. John and I were talking a little bit before we went live today about the idea of placing battles within the context of the campaign. And one of the things that I think public historians struggle with at historic sites is we tend to tell the story when the first shot happens at battlefields and sites of skirmishes without really placing that battle within the context of the larger military campaign that occurred. So tonight we're gonna not be looking at the attacks on the redoubts at Yorktown. We're not gonna be looking at Surrender Field. We're not gonna be looking at any of that. We're looking at the events that lead up to the Siege of Yorktown. So John, let's get started by asking a question I like to talk and ask authors about is, what led you to write this book? Obviously, you have a long background and career in military history, so you have many different subjects in which to write and publish on, which I've read many of your articles over the years on numerous different topics in military history. But why the road to Yorktown?
Well, Dan, first, thanks for having me, and appreciate the invitation from Emerging Revolutionary War. I've known a lot of you all for quite some time, including yourself and Rob, Philip, and Mark. So I'm glad to be involved in some way with the project. So that's great. And appreciate you guys having me on, and for the audience, thank you for tuning in tonight. How I got started on this was, believe it or not, was with my first career when I was an insurance investigator for Progressive Insurance. Now, Progressive did not send me out looking for Revolutionary War documents and artifacts. That was not my job. But what I did was I was traveling between Richmond and Charlottesville about 3 or 4 days a week for about 5 years. And I was always interested in the Civil War, but as I traipsed between Richmond and Charlottesville, I noticed how many Revolutionary War campaign of 1781 historical markers were on the roadside. And I used to stop at them and say, well, maybe I ought to learn a little bit more about this campaign, because I was surely a fan of reading about Yorktown. And so my first article I decided to write, first thing I ever really wrote of substance, was an article about Bannister Tarleton 1781 raid on Charlottesville to try to disrupt the legislators and capture Jefferson. And that was published in a very nice but now defunct magazine that was published by the Library of Virginia called Virginia Cavalcade. And they did a nice job with the article. And that led several years later, actually many years later, in 2008, to a more detailed look at Cornwallis's invasion of Virginia, particularly related to Goochland County for the Goochland County Historical Society. And so I wrote a very detailed article for their journal that they did a fine job supplementing with maps and illustrations, and that it was a very, very nicely published journal article that they did all the illustrations for. So I decided after that, in about 2014, to try to turn this into more of a book that could get a little bit more traction than a county historical society magazine. So I started writing about Cornwallis versus Lafayette. And that's really kind of how I got into that subject.
I think, one of the things that is so compelling about this book is the way that you tell the story through the eyes of Jefferson, Lafayette, and essentially Cornwallis, although really the British Army as a whole operating in Virginia. What prompted you to focus this story, which is a huge story, including geographically? I mean, stretching from Charlottesville to, you mentioned Fredericksburg and Petersburg, all the way out the Virginia Peninsula to Yorktown. What made you choose to tell this story, this campaign towards Yorktown through the eyes of these individuals?
Well, mostly because of the availability of the records. When you go from Civil War research, it's almost an embarrassment of riches compared to going back 80 years beforehand to the Revolution, where you don't, as you know, you guys know, you don't have all of the private soldier diaries and memoirs like that. You just don't have that for Rev War, especially in the South, where the records were even easier to dissolve and burn, and Civil War and humidity and things like that. So it was really a matter of focusing on where the records were. So Jefferson's published papers were important. Lafayette's Revolutionary War papers for the Southern campaign, 4 volumes were available. Particularly the 4th volume that were edited. And also Cornwallis's papers in the new edition of his papers by Ian Saberton made it very easy to follow along. And so I supplemented that with Wayne's papers, Tarleton's memoirs. There were a few diaries of Continental soldiers, Seymour in the Delawares, the Pennsylvania Officer Journal, records from the Library of Virginia and damages and things like that. So, but basically it was the leaders. Their documents were really the key sources, because anything else is really very hard to find.
And I think that's one of the things that makes the narrative so compelling, is you're getting that 30,000 foot view from the strategic players in Virginia at the time, but you're supporting the narrative with some of those human interest diaries and letters. So take us to the beginning of the campaign. Set the stage for us, as it were. with what's going on in Virginia, what's going on in the war as the road to Yorktown begins?
Well, really, the primary question is, why did Cornwallis invade Virginia? Because without that, there really would have been no story of this campaign, even including Yorktown for that matter. But folks might remember that Cornwallis won a Pyrrhic victory at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse on March 15th of 1781. Greene did not, General Nathaniel Greene was his opponent, and that was in North Carolina near modern Greensboro. And Cornwallis eventually, I'm gonna streamline the story about the North Carolina part, but Cornwallis eventually retired or retreated, depending on how you look at it, down the Cape Fear River to Wilmington by mid-April. Greene shattered him and then decided to move into South Carolina. Cornwallis refitted for a brief time in Wilmington, which the British occupied, and then decided to advance into Virginia. So one thing to keep in mind is that the British had really conquered South Carolina to a large extent, not completely. And he was trying to do the same thing in North Carolina, but it was a situation that's so common in military history is once the British left a town, then the locals, patriots, came back in and the British didn't control the town anymore. So Cornwallis was really, in some ways, looking to do two things. Number one, to try to deliver some knockout blow to really keep the southern area, meaning South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. Georgia had largely been controlled by the British for quite some time. It was a very small population there, but he decided that unless Virginia was subdued, that the logistical part of the war for the Continentals in the South would remain intact. Because as if you read Greene's letters, you can see that as we would say today in modern military history, the Continental Southern Department, their logistical tail went into Virginia. That's where weapons were repaired, and Baron von Steuben was recruiting and drilling and outfitting new Continentals, and food and fodder for the horses. Cavalry they were trying to stand up cavalry because it took bridles and bits and saddles and blankets and stirrup, tons of leather work that required experts to do it, that just, you could not get factories, and I mean, mini factories, you could not get workshops, maybe that's a better word, to do all this stuff in North Carolina if the British were marching around and the Tories or Loyalists were a threat. So that was being done in Virginia, places like Fredericksburg, where the Rappahannock Forge and Hunter's Iron Works were, Prince Edward Courthouse and Charlotte Courthouse, kind of south of Lynchburg, and particularly Chesterfield County, mainly near Chesterfield Courthouse. That's where there was a barracks. Von Steuben was drilling and equipping folks, and the British knew this from their sources in Virginia. You also had, Cornwallis knew that there was an active small force operating in Virginia under the command of General William Phillips. So they decided, he mainly, because his relationship with his commander in New York, General Sir William Clinton, was icy cold and very, very unpleasant. So Cornwallis decided basically on his own, I'm going to move into Virginia. I'm going to knock them out of the war, and that's where it's going to be. Now, Lafayette, I've seen this countless times, Dan, where authors of books, articles, websites, they say that Lafayette's force of 1,000 men were sent south by Washington to defeat Cornwallis, but he actually sent them far earlier than Cornwallis came in. Washington sending Lafayette from New York and New Jersey with 1,000 light infantrymen south to the Chesapeake in Virginia and through Maryland and Virginia. That was in reaction to, number one, Benedict Arnold's raid of early January 1781, and also Philip's raids of April of 1781. And Phillips had already arrived by March of 1781. So Lafayette came to Virginia, reached Richmond late April of 1781 with about 1,000 Continentals by way of New Jersey, Maryland, across the Potomac at Alexandria, and basically took the equivalent of Route 1 down to Richmond, and were able to arrive there late April to prevent Phillips and his force, which was actually fairly large at that point for Southern standards. And was able to prevent him from destroying Richmond. But coincidentally, just as Lafayette was able to do that, Cornwallis moved from Wilmington I believe they left Wilmington the 25th of April, moved and were able to move northward and reach Petersburg in the third week of May with their force. And they met up in Petersburg with Phillips' force, but Phillips had died a week beforehand of a fever. But Cornwallis combined the forces at Petersburg, and he was ready to go after Lafayette and Virginia's logistical infrastructure at that time by the third week in May.
One of the things I think is so interesting about Cornwallis's decision is, again, putting all of these events into context. Cornwallis's army had really been marched into just exhaustion, disease and illness, just rife through his ranks during his time in the Carolinas. So his decision to move into Virginia and set upon yet another campaign is a decision that I'm sure was incredibly hard decision to make for him, with what he had available after those recent events. So Cornwallis has decided to move into Virginia, and the campaign really starts to kick up in the late spring of 1781. What are the initial reactions by the state of Virginia? And I think one of the really interesting, minor parts of the narrative, as far as how it's weaved in, but yet so important, is Jefferson's role as governor of Virginia during the campaign. What is the state of Virginia's reaction? What is Governor Jefferson's reaction when Cornwallis's men finally get into Virginia in the late spring of 1781?
Well, remember, the situation was actually improved by then because of Lafayette's Continentals. The real low point, I think, was Arnold's raid and Phillips' raid, because there were so few Continentals at the time. It was mostly militia, and for those unfamiliar with this geography, the James River is basically, in this period, is basically the equivalent of a 6-lane interstate going from the Atlantic up to Richmond. And the British had an enormous advantage, particularly if the winds were favorable and the tides were going up into the James. And they could move their forces at will all up and down the James River, including, Norfolk and Portsmouth. They're not on the James River, but they're close by. But Hampton, and up to past Jamestown, past Williamsburg, various landings on both sides of the river, and up to Richmond, past City Point and Hopewell. So the British really were active and very devastating, and particularly in March and April of 1781. Now, Lafayette and his men showed up in Richmond to help bolster whatever militia forces the state was able to procure. But the government of Virginia had decided in early May to move from Richmond to a new location to meet in Charlottesville. And Charlottesville, in 1781, you may be shocked to learn this, Dan, but there was no football stadium there. There was no bypass to Route 29. Charlottesville was a very small town. It was only founded in the 1760s when they moved the courthouse there to Albemarle County. But there was the courthouse, there were a few taverns. There were not enough inns in the town to be able to handle all the delegates. So a lot of the delegates stayed in wealthy homes and plantation homes outside of the town itself. But they had moved there. I don't remember the exact date, but they were there by the middle of May, certainly. And so was Jefferson and Benjamin Harrison and Archibald Carey, a lot of the bigwigs of the Virginia Senate. The state printer was there, who was very important in issuing proclamations, particularly if they wanted to bring out the militia. So that was the center of government. It was a very attractive site for Cornwallis, but that really wasn't his objective to start out with.
So we now have Cornwallis and Lafayette have moved into Virginia, and this chase, this cat and mouse game begins, if you will. I think you describe it in the book as like a desperate band of robbers as that plays out. Tell us a little bit about what Lafayette is doing, what Cornwallis is doing as they play this game throughout really the late spring and most of the summer of 1781.
Mm-hmm. So it really began when Cornwallis reached Petersburg, and they decided he consolidated Philip's troops in Petersburg with his own. He had a force of about 7,000 men at that point, but once he crosses the James, he sent off Arnold with some loyalists and 2 regiments of Hessians and some other troops down to be the garrison of Portsmouth. That was the main British base before Yorktown, was Portsmouth, not Norfolk, but Portsmouth. But his this campaign really started when they crossed the James. British crossed the James River from the south side to the north side at Westover Plantation, and that was on the 25th of May. And really, you can consider that this campaign went from the 25th of May through and a little bit after the Battle of Greenspring near Williamsburg, and that battle was fought on July 6th of 1781. So it was about a 6 or 7 week campaign. And Lafayette's he has very interesting, colorful, and amusing correspondence a lot of times with Washington and with Greene too. And he would write quips like, "My army is not big enough to get beaten, and I can't fight yet because we don't have anybody to fight with." And when the British were on their way back to the Williamsburg area, he said, "I'm going to follow Cornwallis closely to make it look like he's retreating from me, even though he could turn around and bite me really, really fast." But Lafayette knew that his force, at least for that time, supplemented by Virginia militia, that was really the only force that he knew that he was going to get. And at this point, remember, the decision to come to Yorktown with Rochambeau and Washington together, when they got notice of the fleets coming, that was not known in May and June and early July. That was still a complete fantasy. So Lafayette really had to operate by being very, very cautious about the size and experience of Cornwallis. And he also made note of how fast the British could move, even not just including Tarleton and the cavalry, but how fast the infantry could move in a day, and he always had to move camps frequently. So one of the things he did was he always tried to keep a natural barrier between him and Cornwallis. And I make that point in the book. I'm not the one who came up with that, but I emphasize it for sure. And so in Virginia, that is, of course, in the Piedmont and the Tidewater, that is water. There's no real mountains to do that. So when Cornwallis crossed the James River at Westover on May 25th, it took 2 days to do that. All of a sudden, Lafayette, who is near Richmond, south of Richmond, but all of a sudden Cornwallis on the same side of the river. We got to go. At that point, now Westover, at that plantation Westover, it's on the James River. Those of you who know the area, it's on Route 5, the River Road, southeast of Richmond. That's where he sent back some troops to Portsmouth, and he set about trying to destroy Virginia's logistical infrastructure. And the ways to do that, obviously, were to try to destroy and crush depots of supplies, disperse militia, try to parole them or imprison them, but also to burn tobacco, because tobacco was Virginia's money. And if Virginia didn't have any money, they couldn't go down to the West Indies and buy arms and lead and gunpowder and saddles and bridles and guns, bayonets and shoes. So a lot of what he destroyed, especially along the Mattaponi and the Pamunkey rivers, kind of northeast of Richmond, was that, and that's how he moved. He took his men from Westover to what's now the Malvern Hill battlefield from the Civil War, but Malvern Hill was a well-known open high ground, which was considered to have been far, far healthier than hanging out by the James River in the swamps, and that's what he did. From there, he went through White Oak Swamp, another Civil War place, crossed the Chickahominy at Bottoms Bridge. Again, those who know the Peninsula Campaign of 7 days, these places are all very familiar. And a lot of what he destroyed was along the Pamunkey and the Mattaponi at places like Newcastle, which is completely gone today, Hanover Town, which, again, nothing left, moved to Hanover Courthouse. And it was from there, Lafayette realized that Cornwallis was moving to his left. Lafayette realized Cornwallis was moving to Lafayette's left and was getting behind him. So Lafayette had to keep moving north because he thought Cornwallis was heading to Fredericksburg. So Lafayette's trail, which I detail in great detail in the book because it has not been done before. And if I can make an aside here, I would say that everything other than Johnson's book on the Yorktown campaign for the 1880s, which has been reprinted by by Eastern National, which even though it's 100 and help me out with the math here, 140 years old.
40 years old.
Right.
Yeah.
It's still very good. It's very, very good. But a lot of the modern books, including Osprey's Yorktown campaign, Ketchum, and I don't want to blast these guys. They did fantastic jobs in their book, but they're inaccurate because the maps are inaccurate and the locations are inaccurate. And if you just read Lafayette's correspondence day by day and where Cornwallis was day by day and supplement it with some diaries and soldier diaries, you can see that Lafayette crossed the Chickahominy not far from roughly where Route 1 crosses into Hanover County today. And I don't know if you want me to go into detail where these places are today, but he moved up into Hanover, past Scotchtown, which is Patrick Henry's house, and eventually into Spotsylvania County. Cornwallis moved in Hanover County to the east and looked like he was heading to destroy the Fredericksburg places, Hunter's Iron Works and Rappahannock Forge, which were major places where everything from crudely made cavalry swords to camp kettles and metalwork were done, some weapons. Now Cornwallis eventually moved to a place called, in the Revolution, it's called Cook's Ford. It was a ford over the North Anna River that went from Hanover County into Caroline County. And for those of you who know or have been to the area, it's a little bit east and a little bit, a little bit west and a little bit south of where King's Dominion is today. And in the Civil War, that was called Oxford. So anywhere you see in the 1864 overland campaign, the North Anna, Battle of North Anna, it's always listed as Oxford, but in the Revolution was Cook's Ford. So Cornwallis reached there by about June 2nd. And by that time, Lafayette was trying to cover Fredericksburg and had moved into Spotsylvania. Lafayette had gotten word that there were more troops coming from the north, and these troops were going to be Pennsylvanians led by Brigadier General Anthony Wayne. Those troops he knew were going to be marching by way of York, Pennsylvania, Frederick, Maryland, and crossing the Potomac near modern, and by then there was still a small settlement there, but Leesburg, Virginia. So Lafayette was not only retiring back to the north, but also a little bit to his right, to the northwest, so he could reach out and combine with Wayne, who was bringing about 1,000 Pennsylvania troops down. So by this time, June 2nd, June 3rd, at Cook's Ford on the North Anna, Cornwallis realized that, wow, Lafayette has moved so far north that he has just uncovered all of the depots on the upper James River at Point of Fork in Fluvanna County, Charlottesville, another small town in the southern part of Albemarle County called what then was called Old Albemarle Courthouse, is now called Scottsville. They just and all of a sudden the Virginia legislature, they're not really protected by Lafayette's men anymore. So he decided, we're not going to Fredericksburg, we're going to Charlottesville, and we're going to Point of Fork, which is on the James River. This is all directly west of his position. And so he sent 2 mounted expeditions out in front of him, one of which he sent the Queen's Rangers and some infantry under the command of Lieutenant Colonel John Graves Simcoe. And they were to head out as fast as possible southwest of Cook's Ford toward Point of Fork. And Point of Fork is where the Rivanna River in Albemarle County meets with the James River. And the state of Virginia and the Continental Army had established everything from cartridge making, repairs of everything, troop drilling, barrels of stuff that were military and food, and that's where Simcoe was headed. To make a long story short, Simcoe was able to capture that place, force von Steuben across the James River, and then meet back up with Cornwallis. The second expedition, which I've done the most research on, and I swear I'll never write anything about it again because I've told the same story in greater detail every time. I don't think I can get more detail, but others should try. I would love to read it. And that was Tarleton's Charlottesville raid. And Bannister Tarleton was the hard-hitting, take no prisoners, bloody ban. And he took troopers of his British Legion along with infantry from the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and they made a lightning raid from Hanover through Louisa Albemarle, while they were at a place called Cuckoo Tavern. It was not called Cuckoo Tavern at the time, but the tavern there in Louisa County. Jack Jewett, a local Virginia militiaman, he saw them, rode like hell through the night, got to Charlottesville, warned Jefferson, Paul Revere of the South, that whole thing. Yep. And he warned the legislators in Virginia, hey, you probably should adjourn very quickly because Tarleton's coming. So Tarleton was able to go through Louisa in that area, Boswell's Tavern, places like that, and come down through what's now Shadwell. And Jefferson was able to escape. The legislature skedaddled to Stanton in the Shenandoah Valley. Several legislators were captured, including Daniel Boone, and Tarleton and Simcoe retreated down to where Cornwallis's main body had gotten, which was almost a point of fork, and he got to a place called Elk Hill, which was a Jefferson property in the far western part of Goochland County. And by this time, however, they were at Elk Hill for several days, left there on June 15th. But to get back to Lafayette's side, Lafayette eventually crossed the Rapidan, all coincidentally near the heart of the Chancellorsville and Wilderness battlefields for the Civil War. So a lot of the sites where this stuff happened for Lafayette are preserved. They're Civil War sites, but we won't hold that against them. So Lafayette retreated across the Rapidan to a place called Ely's Ford, and anybody knows anything about Chancellorsville and the wilderness knows Ely's Ford, and marched in an arc to the west toward Orange Courthouse to try to meet up with Wayne, which he did on June 10th. And they moved down to Charlottesville area to prevent Tarleton or Cornwallis from attacking Charlottesville again. So both armies moved back along the way. Cornwallis along the James River on the River Road, stayed in Richmond a few days, and got to Williamsburg by the end of June. Lafayette kind of shadowed him during this period. There's a lot of maneuvering here I'm glossing over, but the only two real engagements that happened in this entire campaign were at the end of these maneuvers. And the first one was at a small place called Spencer's Ordinary.
Now, before we get there, we have a couple questions that have come in because this is getting into the exciting part of the campaign. But one of the things before we get into those questions, I want to mention for those that are tuning in tonight, we have heard about a lot of different places and a lot of different reasons for their importance, both tactically, strategically, for both the Americans as well as the British. And I want to point out, even if you're a casual reader or you're someone that feels, I got a really good understanding, I've read a lot about this campaign on the road to Yorktown. One of the great things that John has included in his book is an appendix listing all of these historic sites and locations. And, that's one of the goals of Emerging Revolutionary War. We love talking about this stuff on Sunday nights and we blog about it. But our goal is to get you to these places and see where history happens. So even if you feel, I know about the road to Yorktown, I know about the raid on Charlottesville, the price of admission on this book is that appendix. It's a great narrative. I strongly encourage you to pick it up for that and to learn a little bit more about this campaign. But even if you feel, I really got my Rev War history down, you're going to want to get that information that John has gone through about where these places are located, how to get there, what happened at those places. So I wanted to point that out to our viewers this evening. All right, let's get into some of the questions that we've had so far before we move to these engagements that are going to take place at the end of the campaign. One of the questions we had was in regards to Lafayette. If you had a favorite quip or a favorite sentence or a favorite statement that Lafayette makes during the campaign, and on the opposite side of that, what would be your your favorite or you think the best biography about Lafayette is?
Biographies are hard because they tend to treat this, and this again, it's a great question. And I'm sorry to say that a lot of the biographies is the reason why I decided to write this book about this campaign, is because they gloss over this period in one or two paragraphs, if at all. A fine historian, a woman, wrote a biography about Lafayette maybe 10 or 11 years ago. Fine job. I have it. I've read it twice, but really doesn't cover it all. And to put it in perspective, George Washington needed to send troops to Virginia, his home state, to prevent the British from looting his home state. Yeah. And who did he send down there? He sent Lafayette. And to have nothing in some of these books about this. And again, another book, I don't mean to criticize that, but one of the books by a former Park Service ranger that's available in bookstores all over, including the Yorktown Center, really does not cover this very well. And now, maybe, I don't want to criticize someone else's book for what they didn't do, right? But that's why I wrote the book, is because to get into that. Now, let me think about the biography thing, and I'll get back with Dan, and I'm sure he and the emerging folks can somehow get that out in their blog. Maybe I'll write a little blog entry or something for that.
That would be great.
Lafayette's so many good quips, but one of them is about the fact was about him. Well, two of them. One of them was he didn't even have enough troops to get beaten, which means that not only would he have been trounced by Cornwallis, his army was too small to even get on the same playing field, to use a football analogy on a Sunday. It was just, and the other one was something along the lines, but I don't have it in front of me, I'm sorry to say, but the other one was when he was shadowing Cornwallis, he wrote Washington and said, "I'm following close enough to make it look like he's retreating from me." Whereas that was completely false. Now, this brings up another point. I see this again and again and again in so many new books that have come out in the last 4 or 5 years about the Southern campaign. Most of it by people who don't do their homework. Is somehow somebody wrote years and years and years ago, decades ago, could be in the 1800s, that Cornwallis said, "The boy cannot escape me," saying that he was going to get Lafayette. Cornwallis never wrote that to anyone, and it's a bastardized confusion from a letter that Sir Henry Clinton wrote, and it's not even clear it was about Lafayette. So never believe that. That is completely false.
And I think that's what you raise a really good point as we talk about other works on this time period, whether it be through a Lafayette biography or other campaign studies or things related to the Siege of Yorktown, is the study of historiography. And I think for folks that have maybe read one book on Yorktown, maybe you picked up, Bert Davis's book on Yorktown, that get into many of these other works that cover this topic, and you can begin to piece together the larger story of how it has changed over time, thus, historiography. And that leads me to one question we had, was the name of your book again, which is The Road to Yorktown, a fantastic work through the History Press. Subtitle is Jefferson, Lafayette, and the British Invasion of Virginia. We had a question about what units came with Lafayette south. They wanted to know perhaps what states those units represented, and any particular units that really stick out in the narrative or that really stick out in your mind.
So most of the units he brought down were the light infantry that was with Washington's campsites along the Hudson River. Most there were a lot of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, some Delaware troops were with him. There might have been some from Massachusetts as well, but they grabbed a lot of the light infantry companies from those states. Those are the ones who came with Lafayette. One interesting little note about that you can read in Lafayette's correspondence is that after they crossed, the men were very reluctant to come south in the summertime. All these New Englanders, they had heard nothing but horror stories about malaria and bad water and camp fever. And so when the army crossed the Susquehanna into, in Maryland, just below the Pennsylvania line, very close to Havre de Grace, Maryland, after they passed, Lafayette left a guard on the northern side of the ferry, and they were to look for any folks who decided that they had had enough of the campaign and were trying to get back up north. That was an interesting little detail. Lafayette's got a lot of little details. And before we finish up with Spencer's Ordinary Greenspring, Dan, first of all, thank you very much for your compliments on my book. The appendix part, folks, one of the things that I did and I realized is I drove every route that Cornwallis, Lafayette, Simcoe, and Tarleton made on this during this campaign, and went to every campsite, every 18th century building that's mentioned that you can still find. And I swear to you folks, I'd say 80% of it is still out there.
Yes.
Which sounds shocking for Northern Virginia, but it's really most of this we're talking about is south of Fredericksburg, west of 95, north of the James. A lot of this is out there. Even just to give one obscure example, which I put in the book and I have a picture of it, Tarleton's headquarters in Charlottesville overnight of June 3rd and 4th, 1781, where they captured Daniel Boone. And because he wasn't considered to be a gentleman, they didn't parole him. They threw in a coal house. That building with the headquarters, that's still standing in Charlottesville. You can see it right from the street. So anyway, I hope you would enjoy that to do that. But
we can't, the folks here at Emerging Revolutionary War can't speak of it highly enough. We were talking with John a little bit before the program started this evening. I think it was about 2 years ago, a number of us from Emerging Revolutionary War, we read John's book and we really dug into that appendix, and we went out and followed that appendix and went to all these sites. And I think one of the things that was so illuminating was what you're talking about, is how much is left. For myself, as a 19th century military historian who just a couple of years ago is moving into that 18th century world, I was shocked that this story was not more in the forefront of the historiography, let alone covered along some sort of tour route or tour guide to send folks to these places. And John has done all of the hard work of finding these places that you can still go and visit. Those that are private property, he's got pictures of in the book. So highly encourage
Thank you very much.
You to pick that up. And we had another question again for the name of the book. The name of the book is The Road to Yorktown, Jefferson, Lafayette, and the British Invasion of Virginia by the History Press. One last question, John, before we get into Spencer's Ordinary and Greenspring, which, oh my gosh, the Greenspring battlefield, what an awesome place in Virginia. You can just imagine those troops moving across those fields. One of the questions we had was, folks are really enjoying the program tonight, and do you ever do any tours or programs related to the 1781 campaign?
I've been asked to from the Richmond Revolutionary War Roundtable, and we did Tarleton's Charlottesville raid a long time ago, and one other one, I think, some other ones too. I'd be more than willing to try to arrange something informally too. So that's definitely a possibility. And again, there's a lot to see. It's a little bit spread out, but I don't want to say too much at this point because it's really in the early stages, but another historian and I, who are Army historians, are working on getting a project off the ground of kind of summarizing what we're talking tonight, adding much more on Spencer's Ordinary and Green Spring, and going through the siege and surrender at Yorktown. So
Wow.
we're trying to get a proposal off the ground among our busy lives, but we've been out to Green Spring and Spencer's Ordinary in the summertime to check things out and see what we can find. But yeah, I maybe we can throw together something. Speaking of the tours and weekends, I noticed. I don't remember Rob or Bert sending me an invitation to this weekend tour of the places in my book, and surely Rob must have forgotten. It must have been oversight on his part. But I'll get with him next week.
That sounds fantastic. You heard it here, folks. Emergent Revolutionary War, we'll work with John. We've had a number of requests on the chat this evening to do a tour of these sites, which, as I mentioned, that's the whole goal of ERW and the historians we bring on Sunday nights to talk. Is we want you to go to these places to experience this history. One of the things I like to say when I'm working at Gettysburg in the summers, if you're not sweating, you're not doing history right. So right. You need to be out there and at these locations. So as we're running out of time, let's get to the climax of the campaign, which is the actions at Spencer's Ordinary and Green Spring. Obviously, as we're moving in order, let's start at Spencer's Ordinary. Talk us a little bit through about the the engagement and the results of that and how it leads into Green Spring.
Okay, so after Richmond, Cornwallis moved to Williamsburg, and I have the routes are all easily traceable today. You can see places like New Kent Courthouse and several churches and crossroads. Lafayette following behind him a little bit farther back, hang back a little bit. And when Cornwallis got to Williamsburg by about the 21st or 22nd, I have to check that, of June, Lafayette was following him down the peninsula toward what today would be Newport News and Williamsburg, and sent out a foraging expedition under Simcoe to try to get some sweet potatoes and some fodder for the troops. And Lafayette sent a detachment out to try to attack this detachment. And they met at an intersection in today's James City County, 6 miles west of what's now, the historic area of Williamsburg, called Spencer's Ordinary. And it was a little bit of a confusing fight. It lasted probably an hour or so. The British lost some casualties. Eventually, they forced the Americans back northwest. But it was an engagement. Simcoe was concerned enough about the American forces around him gathering that he sent word back to Cornwallis, and Cornwallis started to march toward Spencer's Ordinary with the whole army. And today at Spencer's Ordinary, there's much land that hasn't been developed around it, but there's not much to see.
It's been turned.
Well, a lot of it is on the grounds of what's called Freedom Park. So you can see the ground, but it's so thickly wooded.
Yes.
That you can't really get any sense of the undulations of the terrain and topography. You can see the crossroads and the rough location of where the tavern was. So Lafayette retired back from Spencer's Ordinary to a place nearby called Chickahominy Church. That crossroads is still easy to find. And later, Cornwallis decided that they were going to move from Williamsburg across the James River and eventually to Portsmouth. And so the way to do that was to march from Williamsburg down the main road to Jamestown, the same settlement that everybody knows about in 1607 and what have you. But that's where they could ferry their troops across because it was pretty narrow at that section. Well, Lafayette had come fairly close to the British Army and was at a location called Green Spring Plantation, which was north of where the battle took place. And Lafayette made the mistake or the assumption that that there was part of the British Army still left on the north bank of the James and the others had crossed over. But Cornwallis tried to trick him by hiding some of his troops in a low area concealed by a bank. And you can see this area today. It's a place called New Church. I'll have to check that. But it's now, the battlefield is now, and the British position is now where Virginia's Jamestown Museum is, the Jamestown settlement parking lot, and there's a public beach there. So Lafayette sent, excuse me, Lafayette sent General Wayne with a small detachment toward the British landing where he thought he would attack the remnants of his troops, but most of the army was there. Long story short, Wayne overextended himself. The British appeared. He was flanked. The only thing he could think of to do was to actually charge forward to blunt the attack, then withdraw. They had to leave two of their cannons there on the battlefield because all the horses had been shot down. Lafayette was able to avoid a disaster. Brought his whole army down there. Cornwallis said, okay, you know, we lashed out at them, gave them a bloody nose, let's get across the river. And eventually, of course, they moved to Suffolk and Portsmouth, Norfolk, and I won't ruin the rest of the story, but I'll just say they went to Yorktown, and most folks know what happens there. But the Green Spring battlefield is a lot of it's in private hands, although not really interpreted as a battlefield except one wayside that has some good signage. But I recommend that if you go there, you know, park near the signage on the Green Spring Road, or if that's too full, there's only about 6 sites there. You can park at the Virginia Victory Center. I'm sorry, Virginia Jamestown Center, and easily walk a flat paved trail. The only thing I'll recommend though is don't go there when the corn is high, because the last time my son and I and this fellow historian and I were there, I never even considered that because I've only been there in the cold weather, and the corn was, you know, 6 feet high and you can't see anything at the battlefield. So go from late October through maybe early May, and you can see the ground and follow that. But it's a great site, and you know, hopefully there'll be some more signage there in the future.
Well, John, I want to thank you for an incredible hour. I can't believe it's over already. Again, John's book, The Road to Yorktown, Jefferson, Lafayette, and the British Invasion of Virginia. You know, folks at home watching this evening, you can probably see over my shoulder just a small fraction of my library. I am pressed for space. So each book I put on my shelf is something that deserves to be there and needs to be there to get a better understanding of these events in American military history. And I very proudly have The Road to Yorktown on my shelf. I reference it often. And so I encourage all of you folks watching this evening to go ahead and pick up John's book. Before we sign off this evening, I want to remind folks that we'll see you again in 2 weeks on October the 30th with our next ERW Revelry. And those bus tickets, we only got 4 tickets left for the November tour, the second weekend of November. So if you're interested in that, please send us an email, reach out on Facebook. If you're on the fence about it, trust me, you are going to want to be on this tour. You're going to see a lot of great behind the scene things, learn some of those stories like we heard this evening that are not really told. the movements leading up to the Battle of Monmouth, some really neat spots there, some of the behind the scenes actions at Valley Forge, digging into logistics. You know the old saying, and I'm sure John has heard it, that amateurs study tactics, professionals study logistics. You need to understand the logistics that go on at Valley Forge. So a great tour. Check in with us. John, thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to bringing John back on in the future, and hopefully working with John to set up a day where we can get all the viewers that were interested this evening to join you on those battlefields, Spencer's Tavern and Green Spring, and visit some of those sites with the 1781 campaign. For Emerging Revolutionary War, I'm Dan Welch, and thanks again, John, and we'll see you next time on our Sunday Night Revelries. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.